Hi everybody, good afternoon. Welcome to today's event on One System. I am Vibs. I will be chairing this panel today. First of all, I'd just like to shout out Sustainable Fashion Week, all of the volunteers and the team for putting this together. It's really exciting to be here in person for the first time after a long time. And we're going to be talking about how fashion is complicit in the exploitation and marginalisation of people of colour. So we're going to be talking to these incredible panellists today. Before I start, I just wanted to reiterate that it's a safe space, not a judgmental space, and we want to engage with all of you as much as possible. So there will be a Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions, save them and we will get to them at the end. So a bit about me. I studied psychology at University of Southampton and did a few modules on climate change and global challenges. As a result of that, kind of found myself wanting to pursue a career in sustainability. And I'm also the founder of South Asians for Sustainability, working in business consultancy and sustainability for the last kind of 2 years. I've really found the need for a space for people of colour, particularly South Asians, to talk professionally, network, build a community. So that's what our platform does. And we try and make content really relevant on a cultural level to South Asian people. We spotlight various professionals, and I've networked with over 100 different South Asian people till date. Please do check out the page if you would like to learn more about South Asians working in the sustainability space. Without talking much more, I'd like to introduce each of the panelists and invite them to tell you a bit more about themselves. So if we start with you, Mayisha.
Sure, thanks. Hi, my name is Mayisha. I run a blog called Also Ethical. So that basically began when it was in 2013, I just got into uni. And that was the Rana Plaza collapse, which, as many people I'm sure are aware, a building, 8-story building with garment factories inside, collapsed, killing over 1,000 people and injuring hundreds. That was kind of a point for me where I realized I needed to do more than just kind of be sad and annoyed. So I created the blog. It initially began as kind of here's my secondhand clothing, I bought, and here's a brand I really like. But as the years went on, I became more angry and more infuriated with the system. So I studied labour, social movements and development at SOAS to understand kind of have an in-depth understanding of systematic exploitation in the garment industry and generally across the supply chain. And so I kind of diverted, and now I still run Also Ethical, but it's more about collective action and challenging the system and giving effective solidarity with our brothers and sisters in the global south. And I also work in business and human rights as a job. That's it.
Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Kalkidan.
Thank you. My name is Kalkidan Legesse. I am the co-founder of an ethical retailer called Sanchos based in the southwest, and I am the founder of a new startup aiming to standardise the resale experience and help brands manage the lifespan of their clothing called Shwap. So that's my headline. I came into fashion not really knowing how garments were made. I learned how they were made watching weavers and spinners in Ethiopia, and it was there that I realised the real potential the industry has in redistributing wealth. Fashion products take high levels of skills to produce, and they can be done in a wide variety of ways. My first business was a weaving company, and we would train widows in Ethiopia to produce clothes, scarves and garments, and we could take the most simplistic looms, put them in very rural areas that don't have roads or post offices, and people could earn 4 or 5 times the national wage. And that really sparked my interest in fashion. But over the past 7 years, I opened a pop-up shop and then a shop and then stocked over 100 brands, and learned very quickly and very clearly that isn't the standard experience for garment workers. And actually, rather than allowing individuals to hone masterful skill sets, there's high division of labour, high level exploitation, and real injustices across the industry. An area that I'm kind of more interested in now is the end life of garments. I think this is something that we're all becoming increasingly conscious of as sustainability has become more normalised. the reality that, you know, once we're done with our items and we dispose of them, they do end up in markets, again in the global south, where they once again, you know, challenge industries and they once again pollute. And what I'm really, you know, passionate and focused on now is how you tie the brands who have profited from the production of those clothes, both to the consequences in the supply chain, but also the consequences in the end of life of the garment. So that's what I do, and that's me. Oh.
You go for it.
Okay.
Hi everyone, my name is Farihah Choudhury. I run ECBC Sustainability, which is something that started in 2018 as I was finishing an undergrad degree in biology. And it all started off being about plastic-free swaps and buy your stuff secondhand. And then I quickly realised the problems we have in sustainability are systemic. So I actually found Mayisha's blog, and I was quite inspired by her work on labour rights, which spurred an interest in kind of fashion, sustainability and ethics. My main kind of interests within the sustainability space are circularity, fashion and food. As a day job, I'm a nutritionist and I work in public health. So all the work I do is basically around systems and kind of system change and how we adjust that as consumers, but also as you know, businesses, corporations, and governments. Yeah, that's me.
Thank you. We're going to be passing this around quite a lot. But no, thank you for sharing that. Is it not?
I really.
I'll just allow it. Okay. If you can't hear me at any point, just let me know. And the panelists. But yeah, no, thank you. But no, thank you for that. We are going to have quite an informal conversation today about various topics. It's going to be quite insightful. So I'd like to start with Mayisha first, just on a broader kind of question. How do you think the fashion industry drives exploitation and marginalisation of people of colour?
Yeah, so before I began, I wanted to highlight the fact that today is the 9th anniversary of the Ballet factory fire. This was a fire in a garment factory in Pakistan where, I can't remember the exact, I think it was 120 people died and hundreds were trapped inside. And there were limited fire exits, most of the windows were barred, and so workers essentially were trapped inside as the fire spread. And this was supplying a company called Kick, which is a German factory, a well-known company in Germany. And since then, the workers, they've had, instead of mourning, they've had to continuously fight for compensation from this brand. The brand audited the factory with a company called Rena, and a week before the fire, they gave it the all clear. And neither of them refused to take accountability for what had happened. And only in 2018 did they receive any compensation, but only because the workers organised their own victim association, and they fought to get a lawsuit against the company. So these workers had no opportunity to mourn their loved ones. They had to fight for compensation from the brand. And this 9 years later, if you look at conditions now, so I quickly looked at any factory fires that have happened in garment factories this week, and there's been one every day. If you look at them, I've got a list. There was one in Karachi, there was one in Indonesia, Taiwan, Egypt, Bangladesh, and in India, where 2 were killed. And so I guess that kind of sums up where we're at now, where 8-9 years later, we're seeing people. This is only this week, there's been these many. And just last week, there was a factory fire in the same area as the Bhatia factory, where in a luggage factory where, I can't remember how many killed, but it was a very big factory fire. And so I think for me, when we look at things like that, we realise how little has changed and how this system is solely dependent on, again, the exploitation of workers in the global south. Like, this wasn't, I think a lot of brands, they kind of put this kind of perception of, oh, this is such a horrific thing that's happened, this is an isolated case. When you look at the constant cases that have been happening throughout, and when you look at how the system is kind of built so that these Western and Northern general companies can then easily go into these countries without any sort of regulation. There's no regulation put in place because they can easily go into these countries. I think when you look at a system, sorry, I paused the question. I'm going on on a tangent.
No, carry on.
Okay, yeah, it's like, because I feel I'm going to go too deep into it, but I think when we look at the Global South, I think we need to look at it as it's a system, it's a structure, it's put in place, this is the purpose. And we look at fashion, this is a tool of this model that was put in place post-colonial era. Because how else would they be able to exploit people and make profit without the kind of the sort of colonial systems in place? They needed a new system. And so now we've got this new system where these companies now have, there's no regulation, they can easily go into these corporations can go into these countries and do what they will because they can get cheap labour. There's no kind of regulation, there's no accountability, as we've seen through these factory fires. And it's a whole system that's just put in place for this purpose. And not, in my opinion, like there's a lot we've got to do to stop this. But I think it begins with addressing the fact that this is a system that's put in place solely to exploit garment workers and workers in the Global South.
Thank you for sharing that. And I think it's really valid to bring up garment workers specifically because in a lot of the conversation that's pretty lost. And we've seen how the pandemic has highlighted this exploitation more. So I'll open it up. Would you like to share a bit more about that?
Yeah, sorry, I just wanted to add a couple of things.
Yeah, sure,
What
please.
Mayisha was saying. I think, like her work is amazing and you'll learn a lot about it following her. But just to add, India was one of the largest economies before the colonial period. It accounted for 23% of global GDP.
Could you speak up a bit? Sorry.
Yes, I can. And please do tell me if I'm not loud enough. I have
Do you
got a
wanna
tendency
try-
of
do you wanna try
speaking
this?
into my own mouth. Is it working now? Yeah?
A little bit.
Okay.
Is there a volume thing?
Gosh, I'm going to try. You can tell me if I'm not loud enough. It's a nation that was contributing about a quarter of the global economy, and the British pillaged it. Like I was watching, I learn a lot from TikTok. I don't know about you guys, but I was watching a TikTok video, and the Taj Mahal had all of its stone and gemstone beading stolen from it, Colonialism created economies that would centralise wealth and value, extract them from neighbouring regions, and then take that value into the colonial powers, and in this case the UK, so that the wealth could be retained in our nations. And what it did is create supply chains that companies eventually took ownership of. And I think in addition to that kind of supply chain system, there's also a mindset which I think is inherently kind of underlines a lot of the UK's and other Western nations' belief to how they should be interacting with the Global South. And so you can see this in IMF policies where farmers are told to specialise in cash crops, which, if you tell 1 million people to create a cash crop, then the value of that cash crop falls. You can see it in the way that companies are able to tie producers into, buying fertilizers and buying GM seeds and destroying the land, all in the hopes of getting huge purchases from a small number of companies. And, another thing for us to be aware of is how companies exploit nations, because that's really, it's an absurd reality if you think about it, that there's literal boardrooms that will dictate what the wage, the average wage is for millions of people around the world. And the way they do this is that they will pick up and move. They will try to create industries where there is very little level of specialization so that they can move freely around the world and use this, their purchasing power to underprice the value that's being produced. And that's only acceptable to us here because here we think it's normal for there to be billions of people living below the poverty line. Like our hearts and our minds expect that to be the natural order of things in the world, and we think that because of white supremacy. So the fashion industry is a tool, and also fashion has social constructs around our sense of its frivolity, or a sense of it being women's business, or being inconsequential, and that feeling of the inconsequentialism as well enables this exploitation of millions of people. And something that really stood out for me is last year when the stories came out that factory workers in Leicester were being paid £3.50 per hour, so lower than the minimum wage. You know, the amount of uproar that saw, it resulted in Boohoo's share price, one of the companies using these factories, falling, 40% that week. It came back up, but the press coverage was enough to drive that sale immediately. And why is that? Like, why is it so easy for us to empathise with people in Leicester and not in people, in Bangladesh? Like, why? Do you know what I mean? They're people too. So, that's just, I've got a lot of emotions. Mayisha's got the facts. There we go.
Well, that leads on really well, actually. Something that's really kind of messy and complicated and kind of complete that comes out with throes of capitalism, neocolonialism, is actually, if you think about a country like Bangladesh, 80% of their economy is from the garment industry. So how do we disentangle that from sustainability and saying, well, we're not buying fast fashion anymore because this whole country's economy is now dependent on this same industry? But how have we, and I say we as in the global north, how have we facilitated a system where actually this entire country's economy is unsustainably sourced and thriving off of fast fashion and their own exploitation? Because we've said, well, this is the commodity that we're placing in this poor country, and we're going to pay the garment workers 50p a week to do it, and it's going to make up the bulk of the economy, because then how do you take that away? And that is a tool of white supremacy, because you've actually given this country, this tool, an economy that they can't disentangle themselves from, whilst at the same time it exploits their people. Which is why I feel like in conversations about sustainability, it's so important to talk about the systemic tools that facilitate, fast fashion, unsustainable production in any kind of sector, whether that's fashion, food, tech, because at the end of the day, it's a human who's creating these things in a factory or growing the food, and the minute we boycott or the minute we say, well, we're not buying into it anymore, there's actually people who are affected by it. And that's not our fault as individuals, but because it's a system, we kind of have to look at it from that lens too, which is why I really appreciate the work that Mayisha does, because when you try and look at fashion from purely a waste and recycling and sustainability perspective, you think, well, if I stop buying it, then I'm not feeding into the problem, but then it becomes someone else's problem when they're not being able to, afford a living wage or make money for their family. So how do you kind of tackle that whilst still not buying into the system? So that's why we kind of have to change that system, I guess. So this is what I have to know about that.
Yeah,
of course.
Oh, we still haven't.
No, you both said some really great stuff. The only thing I can add is the context last year with what happened with COVID. So last year, obviously, a lot of countries in the global north were going into lockdown, and brands realised that they were going to lose profit because their shops are closing. And so the first place they went to save those costs was to obviously go to the most unprotected legally and financially, and take it from their garment workers. And so what they did was they cancelled all their orders they had with these factories. And on the surface it seems quite, okay, yeah, you would do that. But when you look at how the system works, because, did it just turn off, or was that me?
Yeah.
Okay. And as Kalkidan, she pretty much summarised very well how the structure works. And so what happened was they cancelled their orders, and the way with the factories, it's a bit of a weird system, which clearly shows how the imbalance of power. Because, for example, with me, if I'd go to a shop and I'd say I want this made, get it done, and I'd pay for it. With the brands, they go to these factories, they say, I want this made, and I'm going to pay this much for it, and you can't say no. And then, like Kalkidan said, if you say no, they can easily go elsewhere. And in fact, in some places, in Leicester, they have this as well. They have this, they call it cattle something, where they have the suppliers in one room, and they say, who can get this done for me at the lowest cost? And whichever supplier can do it, they go to them, and everybody else is kind of left to the side. And so with the suppliers, they So yeah, that happened. But with the fact that cancelled orders, it was particularly messed up because they actually had already put the orders in, and they put them in before because they don't pay for it until they receive it. Because that way, when they receive the clothes, they can then say to suppliers, oh, I don't like it. It came a bit late, I'm going to pay you less. And the suppliers they have no power because they're in their country. They can't do anything other than take that money. It's a very, very manipulative system here. So because these suppliers had received these orders, they hadn't been paid for it because it hadn't been shipped. And so these brands used that as a reason to then cancel their orders, and no, they didn't have to pay for those clothes. So these factories had already taken out loans to get these clothes made, because obviously they don't get paid. So they took out loans, heavy loans, for the labour costs, for production, etc. And then they were told, we're not going to pay you. And so they were in heavy debt, and they had no way to kind of pay their workers either, who had already made the clothes or in the process of making the clothes. And this created like a humanitarian crisis on top of a humanitarian crisis. Like the last estimate I remember was 16 billion stolen from garment workers. That was one of the first accounts, and now we know it's millions and millions more. If you look at Clean Clothes Campaign, they have estimates of how much was stolen from workers. And so this whole situation with COVID, it really exemplified the power imbalance that this whole system has, and the sheer power that the brands have to manipulate things so that they can purely just to take money away. And eventually there was like a big campaign called the Payout Campaign, which some of you may have been involved in or seen, which was crazy that we had to do this, but to push brands to pay for to commit to these cancelled orders. And eventually there were U-turns, which was great. And so that was really like a big relief. And I think there was a lot of celebration, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge that we don't know if that money actually went to the workers in the first place. And there's no kind of guarantee. We have no guarantee of that. There's a new Pay Your Workers campaign to ask brands to tell us, please, have these workers even been paid their wages? Because now we've still got workers who haven't been paid since last year. There's protests happening to this day. There's Stylecraft Factory, where they've been protesting since last year for their wages. And these are people on poverty wages. They have no savings because they receive poverty wages. And it's like how, like, with brands, I don't know, like, with me, I have such contempt for them, because how can you even in your mind even think that this is I don't know, how can you justify how do you sleep at night, these people? Because you've literally left people to starve for like a year. On top of COVID, they were protesting outside while there's COVID. Like, it's wild. And then in Leicester, when you look at what's happened there's migrant workers there who are working every 7 days a week during a pandemic in cramped conditions. And when I talk to people who have been to Leicester, they say it's very similar to what's happening in Bangladesh. And the fact that we can say that in the country, which is like the 8th richest in the world, like, it's wild. And there is no coincidence that they are people of colour in those factories as well. And I think that goes back to our first point, because people of colour will always be the ones who are exploited, because they are easily exploitable, largely women as well. And if you look at recent, like a year on, there was an investigation a year on from Leicester last year. It's still the same, and do you know what's messed up? Like, sorry, I'm going on a rant. But the investigation found that there was a huge uproar about workers not being paid minimum wage, right? And so this time, the factories are now giving workers minimum wage. But now the workers, they tell these workers, we're going to give you this in your bank account. Now you have to go to a cash machine, get some money out and give it back to us. So essentially, they're basically still being paid poverty wages. And this is the thing, there's no regulation. If you look at the UK government, they don't give a damn about this. Like, they cut all the health and safety protections that could have existed. They put it, so Priti Patel with the supplier, she basically said, oh, it's people don't want to speak out because of like their South Asian, like, what was it? It was a South Asian culture thing. She put it to the suppliers being brown. That's why, because they she's another one, but I could go on. Let's have a think about her, because I could go on for days. But the government, it's like a systemic issue where they there's no regulation there. I mean, they've started putting things in place, but it's hard to put things down as being modern slavery, which is how they're doing it. They're trying to find modern slavery cases, but it's very hard to pick out which ones are technically modern slavery. And so that's why people are finding it hard. It's like a whole bureaucratic system that's making it very difficult to hold anyone to account. The only person who's been held account for Boohoo is probably a supplier, not Boohoo, has been, again, as we said, they control the prices. They control how much the workers get. They control the whole system, health and safety. They've got bonuses. Like, they're still getting bonuses, and they have the audacity to put sustainability, which I think we'll talk about later. But
Yeah.
with COVID, it really, really highlighted how messed up the system is and how we can't keep being on the surface level of being like, oh, yeah, this is really bad. I'm going to buy this and I'm going to cut down my clothes. I'm going to boycott because, like Farihah said, this is not the solution, and we need to really address the systemic issues and challenge them as well and speak out. Because I think when I first started the blog, there wasn't a lot of like kind of uproar about the system as such. Now it's changed completely. Last year particularly, I think it really switched up. I think now we need to be more angry and keep being angry and keep challenging these brands and don't accept these sustainable sort of greenwashing, because as COVID showed, they literally could care less.
No, that's really valid. Thank you for sharing that.
Oh,
thank you.
I'm going to turn it up if you just hold it
Okay.
quite close.
Great, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I think it leads on quite nicely to talking about diversity within the industry. So we know a lot of fashion brands, as mentioned, there's a representation facade on how they portray representation on diversity. So should we talk a bit more about what diversity in the fashion industry should look like or looks like to you?
Yeah. Yes. Can I just add one thing before
Yes,
that?
of course.
I think hopefully what's being understood is that the industry is really exploitative, but it's also really profitable. And just there's like an irony that sits underneath this, where like consumers think that cheap products are their right. They think it's their democratic right to choice, but that choice is highly reliant on this level of exploitation. And actually that does speak to diversity, because why do they think that it's their right? Because they're white, sorry, and they care less for communities that don't belong to their own culture. I know what I've said. I know it was a big thing to say, but how else can you justify the comfort in which people exploit like millions of others and just think that that's the natural order of things? And fashion isn't diverse. Like particularly post 2020, there's a lot more diverse advertising for sure. Like there is. And that's great, because that means a lot of work for models, which is good. But diversity, I think, really is about value and equity. And yes, there is some equity being distributed when you market with diverse people, but real equitable distribution is on the means of ownership, it is on profit, it is on creative asset and value. And we're not even almost there. And I think something which we should really open our eyes to is that so much clothes are being made in the global majority, in the global south, and so few companies are actually owned by these people, like so few. So why is that? Like, can they not write Excel sheets? Can they not do their taxes? Can they not set up a website? Like, they've got all the core skills of doing that, but we see the advertising of people of colour as the equivalent of that level of ownership, and so we don't go out and seek it, and that's crazy, because very little clothes are actually made in the UK. So why can't the people who are making the clothes also be the people who are designing them, marketing them, benefiting from the profit that's created in them? So, yeah, I think that, just to answer the diversity question, I think diversity really is about ownership, and what I would like to see is garment-owned brands. Like, I think that should be the future of sustainable and ethical fashion.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I find it quite interesting, because when Kalkidan was talking about that just now, I kind of imagined a web of ownership, and if you look right at the top, it's the corporation and the CEO, the whatever, the person, the money, and the God, I don't know any of these names because I hate them all, but it's those people. And then, it's the designers, it's the boardroom underneath that. And, most of these spaces are very white. But then as you trickle down this system, you come down to the garment workers, that's where all the people of colour are, and that's where the income is not distributed because all the income is up here. So how can we say that a brand is diverse because they have two, they've got a brown model, they've got a hijabi model, they've got a black model, cool. But where is that income distributed? Where is the labour distributed? It's down here, but the money is distributed up here, so that surely that's not representative, surely that's not diverse. I think that was just something that popped into my head. The other thing, kind of unrelated, but I kept thinking about it as everyone was talking, but the widest commodification of food, of fashion, of our everyday things. We've commodified fashion. Because I work in the food space, because I work in public health, I think about this every day. We've even commodified food to the fact that I can get a packet of crisps in 30 seconds because I just really want it. But do we think about what goes into it, who made it, etc., etc.? It's the same with clothes. We see it as a right, but it's at what cost does that come? But the reason I'm so interested in fashion is because it's really not a basic human right. No one has a right to 5 pairs of trainers or 5 pairs of t-shirts. You have a right to be clothed and have a change of clothes, but you don't have a right to be, the volume of clothes that we actually own. So we've actually commodified fashion to the point where we feel like it is our right. It's our disposable right, and and that comes at a huge cost. So sorry, I kind of diverged from the diversity question there, but I just kept thinking about it.
No, thank you. Please.
So ownership also isn't merely financial. I think an area that is really important and should be pursued more frequently is the ownership of ideas. Let's talk about cultural appropriation. The real problem of cultural appropriation is that an asset is taken from a community and they're not able to have any ownership over its creation, its uniqueness, its potential, its cultural heritage, its financial opportunity. And this happens at lots of different levels. So it happens at a community level, but it also happens just in terms of, individual organizations, within workrooms, within boardrooms. And I think for us to have the kind of the width of creative presentation that we're looking for, we need ways of diverting the ownership of creative assets to a wider range of people. And in fashion, I think this really speaks to garment worker-led design and ownership. But also, I think it speaks to how we interact in our own organizations and it's the difference between, I think there's a really great example of a Jack Hems, I know I'm not pronouncing that correctly, show last year, the show in the lavender wheat field, if anybody remembers that, yeah. So it was really, really beautifully diverse models, and then they just happened to take a selfie at the shoot, and everybody in the creative team were white, and it's this idea that there are decisions being made at so many different levels within fashion and within so many industries, and if we want diversity in them, we have to engage with that question at every level, not just at the point of, okay, well, we're about to do an advertising campaign, how is it going to look for consumers? And the reason that is the priority is because obviously brands are just trying to reposition how they're perceived in order to continue to access a market, and consumers, what they're looking for is that feeling of moral safety in that decision. And so they're hoping to see, oh, okay, well, there's a brown person there, that there's great, there's a plus size model there, that must mean A, B, C, and D, so that they can sit with ease. And our job is to learn to be able and capable of sitting with the discomfort of knowing that it's our actual actions that are resulting in this industry. We're talking about how terrible this industry is. I'm sure all of us are wearing fast fashion products that have resulted in some level of exploitation, and I'm sure we'll all go out and buy one piece this year. We are the system. It's not an abstract person out there doing really terrible things. It's all of us. But until we can sit with that discomfort, we'll be duped by brands who will look for, easy ways to navigate. Sorry, I realised.
No. No, that was really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. And I think it raised a lot on authenticity and what we see and what goes on behind the scenes. So a question for all of you, really. When do you think a fashion brand is being authentic? And how would anybody know? Should we start with Mayisha?
I don't know if I'm the right person to speak about this because I just generally have contempt for a lot of brands. But I guess I wanted to touch on something before with the other question, but so maybe I'll try and make it relate. I think the whole diversity thing, I think it's really, I think I'm pretty much going to replicate what Kalkidan said, but basically to be very aware of the contradiction between what they're showing and what they're doing. And I think with a lot of, I can see myself in that position where sometimes I do see someone like a brown woman on a campaign or something, and I'm like, wow, this is really cool, I hadn't seen that before. And then you kind of remember that this whole system was built, their whole model is built on the exploitation of brown women, and this is clearly not. Representation is basically just brands trying to co-opt into the current, because they realise people are becoming more aware and more conscious and wanting to know more. And so they're trying to find the best ways they can do it without having to challenge their own business model. And the one thing they can't challenge is that profit making, which is exploiting people in the global south. And so they'll find other ways to go about it. And I think diversity has become a really big tool for them, because now I've seen there's been reams and reams of just campaigns. I think Nike was an example that really annoys me. It's they recently got the Nike hijab out, right? And this is really great for Muslim women, and it is really good to have equipment clothing for Muslim women to be able to swim and to go out, etc. And do sport. But at the same time, there are women in Indonesia, Muslim women in Indonesia, in their supply chain being paid poverty wages, where their representation is only for, I guess, people of colour in the global north who can buy their clothes, and when it comes to their own supply chain, it's well, that's out of my business model. And then you've got H&M. They recently did a collaboration with Jayasari, which is a really, really I'm not gonna lie, it's a really good, it's a really amazing brand. They do stunning clothes, and it's really big in India. And then at the same time, just trigger warning, there's a lot of sexual abuse content coming up. There was, around the same year it was announced, there was there was one report coming out about systemic sexual abuse in H&M's supply chain in India, and the report was extremely damning, and the findings were it just showed how endemic it is. It wasn't isolated cases, there were multiple cases in India of this happening in their factories. And then last year, I don't know if anyone was aware, there was the murder and rape of Jayasari, who was a garment worker in one of H&M's factories. And this was a case where they had been bringing up H&M. There's evidence from that H&M knew about the sexual abuse and harassment workers are facing in this particular factory, and they did nothing. And it took the death of a young woman who was a trade unionist as well. She was part of the organising movement. And she'd been facing this for a while, and then more reports are coming out that more women had been facing the same harassment in that factory, and they still didn't do anything. There was a big campaign. The trade union, which is women-led, by the way, and they're Tamil, which is a very kind of marginalised community in India. They organised and they demanded for a legally binding agreement to end gender-based violence in the supply chain, and there was silence from H&M. This is something they can do in 2 seconds. There's one in Lesotho right now, in a factory that supplies Levi's, something else. So there is a model there that exists to end gender-based violence, and instead they leave that. And now, I think, when did the Sabyasachi collection come out? It came recently.
Recently, a few weeks ago.
Yeah, a few weeks ago. They've dropped this huge line, and it's supposed to be really representative. And for me, I find that just completely disgusting, because I can see what they've chosen to represent and what they've chosen not to kind of address, and that's just the harassment and ongoing abuse of women of colour in their supply chain. Completely unrelated, I'm really sorry.
No, it's fine. I think it also highlights quite an interesting topic of within specific cultures or people of colour communities, how there is a difference. Like Sabyasachi is an Indian designer, and there is a huge wealth difference. So I think that really shows as well. Yeah, exactly. So it's really important to talk about. I'm just conscious of time, and we haven't really spoken much about solutions and how we can action change as individuals. So Farihah, I'd like to come over to you about that.
Yeah, so lots of doom and gloom. Because it's a gloomy system, like we can't sort of walk away from the fact that it's a hugely, as everyone else has said, exploitative system that, you know, is completely changing. And I think the solutions lie in the kind of balance between collective individual action and actually targeting the system where it hurts, and actually targeting the pieces of the system where we can, you know, make action by kind of looking at the people on top. So one thing that I have learned over the last sort of 2 years to centre in my actions is always, in terms of fashion, is thinking about the labour that goes behind the label. So it's always centering garment workers in my work around, you know, how do we target the fashion system? Because, as I said before, if we're, for example, doing a boycott of a brand, the idea is obviously for that brand to fall through, but then what happens to the garment workers who are making their clothes, right? So it's about how do we create sustainability within fashion while safeguarding the rights and the labour of the mainly women, but also the men, children who are creating these clothes and who are affected by the brands and the supply chain. So in terms of kind of actions that we can take, you know, I think there's huge value in creating action on social media. I think people kind of like, you know, they turn their head at social media because they're like, oh, you know, Instagram, Twitter, it's all just like, you know, people these days, that's all they do. But actually, it can be a huge tool for change, especially because it enacts a collective voice. So with campaigns like the Payout Campaign, even the campaign for Jayasari a few months ago, you know, there was a lot of people just directly commenting on, like, you know, H&M's posts, and their comment section was just drowned out because of all of the people trying to speak out about this issue. And you know, with like organised actions that are, you know, intended to create a specific change in a specific direction, these kind of campaigns can be really powerful. So there's action in doing that. There's also, we should always use our civil rights, and this is something I'm really hot on, because at school, I didn't learn anything about citizenship, right? But we are citizens. At the end of the day, we have to reframe how we view ourselves. We're not consumers. Yeah, we are because of the system, but actually it's better to see ourselves as citizens, and citizens have democratic rights to make actions. And, you know, we can kind of take stock of the fact that we live in the global north and we're privileged, and we have, you know, to some extent democratic rights to make actions and not endanger ourselves when we do those things. So, you know, writing to MPs, writing to lobby groups and participating in lobby campaigns, and kind of getting that to the part of the system where people can actually make the action is super duper, you know, handy and impactful. And it is about also leading by example as well. I know a lot of the time, even when I do certain things, I'm like, well, what's the point? Because like BP just dumped oil into the ocean, why am I even bothering? But you know, I do think a lot of the time it's about leading by example and leading by the values you want to see the world to be. So it's about doing that collectively, and also kind of hitting the system where it kind of hurts as well, and centering garment workers, I guess. I know you guys have loads of things that you do as well.
Did you want to talk about the resale stuff?
Yeah. So my approach to all of this has always been, are there alternative business models, I guess, that work better? So I have a brand and retailer called Sanchos, and we have 5 key criteria. So products have to be made with natural and organic materials. All products have to be recycled. Products have to be made to last. Garment workers need to have bargaining rights, and, you know, it's got to kind of add value to the customer. So actually this week is Fashion Week, so I'm doing a lot of buying for Sanchos, or at least I'm having a lot of nose to ask our buyers to do buying for the store. And there's a lot that we can't buy. That's something that's really prevalent to me is, you know, you're walking around brands like trying to sell you products and it's like, you know, you can't tell me anything about your supply chain, you can't do that, you know. And so I would say that if you wanted to purchase fashion more sustainably, there are options. And there's a lot of documented information as to like how you might go about and do that. You know, people often say the most sustainable thing is like the thing you already own, but then there is that risk around, you know, what does that mean for garment workers? In my experience, people have so many different reasons for shopping, and oftentimes it's really about how they feel about themselves and their comfort with their identity in their environment. And I'd say that would also be a really good starting point, that if you happen to be somebody who's really you know, heavily reliant on fast fashion brands, you could think about why that is the case, because as a behavioural norm, you know, potentially you might be trying to fill some level of satisfaction through shopping, and that's probably something to investigate within yourself. One thing that I want more people to think about is the lifespan of clothing and where clothing ends up. So in the UK, we have, you know, each of us has at least £1,000 of unworn clothing in our wardrobes. We send 350 tonnes of clothing into landfill. The clothing that we do send to charity shops, 80% of it is exported to, you know, often African countries where it's, you know, oversupplied and therefore burnt, discarded, and it pollutes, you know, natural environments. So there's huge problems with the supply chain, but there's also huge problems with the kind of the end life of products. You know, so putting kind of my business hat on, I thought, okay, well, how do you really begin to manage that? Because there are so many brands, there's so much products, you know, I think there's something like 8 billion products being produced each year. There's a lot. How do you begin to start like envisaging the management of the end life of garments? So for me, I think it's about standardization and information. And so we have launched a new startup called Shwap. And what we do with that is we digitize the ownership of the things that we have. And from that digitization, we hope we can begin to illuminate better ways to manage the end life of garments. And the way that this affects people of colour is that brands are able to exploit because they don't take on the cost of their business model. They don't do this in their supply chain, and they don't do this in their end of life. If we want brands to be responsible for those costs, we need to be able to measure that so that we can begin holding them to account. And after we can measure that, then we can begin to say, hey, you know, you might have sold 8 million pieces of this T-shirt, but 1 million of them are in landfills in Ghana. So how are you going to be responsible for the effective, you know, regeneration of this environment? And I think that is possible. It's yeah, obviously a big project, but yeah, I feel like in terms of what do you do, I think there's lots of opportunities and new business models, and these are the ones that I've been working on.
Thank you. And just a couple minutes.
Yeah, I'll be really quick. I guess very similar to Farihah, like boycotts are not the answer. This is what trade unionists have been saying for a while. They tell us we don't want you to boycott. We want the income. We just don't be exploited in the process. And I think that ties into listening to workers and trade union demands. And I think there have been cases in the past where people have been trying to implicate a boycott. I think there was a case in the US where there was a new bill that was going to come forward about banning child labour. And this resulted in lots of people putting their kids into more precarious work because they needed the income. And to understand this is a systemic issue, we have to understand boycotts can't create this whole system. At the same time, there are cases where boycotts are needed. So, for example, right now, Myanmar, everyone's probably aware of the military coup that's happening right now. A lot of brands initially stopped their orders. And then some of them did supposed kind of investigations on the factories to see if they were linked to the military, and some of them resumed their orders. Now, last week, there was a huge announcement from like 2 of the key trade unions saying for brands to stop orders completely. And so now there's a public call for these brands to stop production, getting their clothes made in Myanmar, which is a big campaign, so please join if you can. Just target the brands. And I guess that joins again to the collective action key to understand what the trade unionists and workers want, and then using your ability. Like, we have free, but very, very, very lucky to be able to not be kind of persecuted for what we have to say. And I think that ties into being able to speak on social media, take advantage of what we have, the free resources we have to be doing that. And like with Payout, we had a big, I mean, there's still a lot of progress, but the fact that we got people to U-turn on their cancelled orders was a big indication of the power we have collectively. And I haven't seen that sort of thing since Rana Plaza, to be honest. So it really showed the power we have. Another thing is not to understand this is an isolated situation, and to support organising happening here. So a lot of workers in the UK are going through the same thing, whether it's workers in Leicester, whether it's lorry drivers right now. A random case I'm looking at the moment is Weetabix factory in Northampton, Hampshire. Like, there's different when you hear about these sorts of cases, understand this is a very systemic issue. Grenfell's another one. I don't know if anyone watched the documentary last week, but it's very reminiscent of what's been happening in terms of the corporation lack of accountability. So support these sorts of issues. They're all tied in, and we're all just to create this global solidarity, because this isn't an isolated situation. This is a systemic issue. Yeah. So
Thank you.
It's not working, but
Thank you. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, I believe. Does anybody have anything they'd like to ask? Yep. Should I take? Should I?
Is there a regulation industry body in the fashion industry?
So there's a call for one to be made at the moment by Tradecraft, the fashion watchdog. They're trying to. There's a similar one with food. I think it's fruit and veg, as far as I know. I don't know too much about it, but there is a current campaign going to have a sort of regulation system in place. So that would be called the fashion watchdog, which you can probably search online. There's a lot of movement happening in the UK right now about due diligence, which is basically to hold corporations accountable in court. There's some bills have been passed in Germany for due diligence, which would allow people to take corporations to court over human rights violations. Corporations are pushing back against this really strongly. So, for example, I don't know, I think it might be in Germany, they eased up on the legal liability terms and conditions as expected, but I think that's something worth tracking. So watch the Fashion Watchdog and also the human rights due diligence updates what's happening, because it's happening across Europe generally and the EU, but the UK, there's starting to be some sort of movement there, especially I think Boohoo as well, watch out for.
Just had a follow-up.
Yeah.
Do you see a place where, for example, tracking calories of food for actual showing the true cost of consumption for the customers? Do you see that happening in the fashion industry? So actually, the transparency of the true costs and breakdown, so customers, properly get the full sense of what they're buying?
Yeah, there's a really great startup. Does anyone know it? I don't know if I know that. But yeah, there are companies that are mapping out supply chains and applying like RD tags and QR codes to different units of supply that would then eventually describe to a customer exactly how that garment came to be.
Are you thinking of provenance?
Provenance, yeah, essentially provenance models, but in the format that it would result in some sort of tag, some sort of labelling on that item to describe where it's from. And I feel really bad that I can't remember the name, but I think they were on Dragon's Den, so I was hoping somebody else would be able to jump out. So I think in the future with retail, we're going to see a lot more kind of VR, AR, data-driven explanation of where, of what the provenance of things are, both in the primary market, but also in the secondary market as well.
Sorry, I just wanted to add as well that regulation-wise in this country, CMA have released some guidelines back in May for retailers across the board. And it's really interesting. I work currently in a business that has a brand in the Nordics and the UK, and there's stark differences on greenwashing, that what is classed as greenwashing in Nordics compared to here. So you'll see that change from that side as well. Anything else to add?
No.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak a bit about overproduction, just because I'm doing a bit of research on it at the moment, and what I'm figuring out is that there's just there's more clothes than anybody could wear being made, and you spoke a bit about the contracts thing, and I think there's maybe something going on with like the minimums, you know, like you have to buy 1 million products to make it half the cost, and that's obviously putting huge stress and pressure on suppliers and obviously manufacturers as well.
No, I feel like you're better.
Does this work, by the way?
It does a bit, I think. Yeah.
It goes off and on, I've realised. Yeah.
Okay. Oh yeah. Okay. Sorry then. Yeah. No. I think so much is rooted in overproduction. So much of the problems that we see. I don't know that fashion brands are like, you know, stuck where they have to produce minimums, and that's the I don't think that's a practical reason why they overproduce. But I'm sure they use that narrative to describe underpaying for products. Like I'm sure that happens. You know, fashion exists in this linear model of business where like every single retailer out there only makes money when they sell a new product. And so to sustain themselves as well as to grow, they just have to produce more. And the brands that are most successful are the ones that have really worked out how to produce the biggest volume, sell the biggest volume, you know, as fast as possible, basically. And they do so to the extent that like consumers are told that, you know, there's this like sense of obsolescence of the things that we purchase. You know, so I think the average garment is worn 2 times. The average kind of sense of, hey, that thing is new, I really enjoy it, lasts about 2 weeks. And then the things that we purchase just absolutely like degrade in inherent value to us. And so I think that what we need to be able to do as a society is really accurately describe where things end up. You know, a brand sold this and it's actually come here. And if where it ends up costs us shared goals, so environmental goals or social goals, like be able to present them back to that brand. And I think if we were able to do that, you couldn't overproduce in a vacuum. And I would think that could help to tackle that. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you. Any other questions?
Yeah, go on. This is for all of you actually. Do you believe that a truly sustainable fashion business can exist at scale?
I'm really sorry to
No,
go again.
I was looking at you as well.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, like honestly, so very personally, I've been selling sustainable fashion for 7 years. And I'm tied to this linear model of business. So for my business to sustain itself, I have to sell more. And I don't want to, like, if I'm honest. And the reason that we've created, the way Shwap works is customers are given tools to resell and repair their clothes with better ease. And when they resell the item, the original brand is paid commission on that resale. So brands will get royalties for the products that they've created over time. And so brands go from being reliant on selling one thing, you know, multiple times, to just creating the best product possible so that it can generate revenue for them for a long life. And I think that is going to make Sanchos a truly sustainable company, and I hope it'll make other brands truly sustainable. The other reality is sustainability comes at this like really increased cost. Like I'll give you an example. All of our packaging at Sanchos is all made with recycled and recyclable materials, and that costs us £30,000 extra a year in comparison to the market norm of like the polyethylene bags. And every decision is like this. Every decision comes at this like extreme increased cost, and then eventually you're either, you know, you can't spend that money on marketing, or you can't hire, you know, you can't grow. And so brands that actually invest in products that last are financially less secure than brands that don't. And hopefully, if we're able to create a practical circular solution for companies, then they'll have a direct incentive to be sustainable. So I think that's the answer. But
if like Primark took on all the things that you do now, would it exist?
no, not like you see it now.
Yeah.
No,
It would have to be a much smaller business.
it would have to charge
Much more.
higher prices
Yeah.
for what it sells, and it also have to. I mean, that's the thing. And like any ethical decision, you know, exists within a scale, and there's, you know, different perspectives on it, right? But I think you would have to ask the question, is that volume of sale, of product sale sustainable? But say if Primark could earn revenue from the things that it produces not once but multiple times, it wouldn't want to optimize so much to overproduction, and potentially through that it could become more sustainable. Yeah.
Anything else to add?
I think if we look at it as well from a purely, the resources that the earth has perspective, we've already pillaged that to the point where we're actually growing cotton on land that can't sustain that growth. So it's also about how regenerative is the system itself, because we can't just continue to have Primark, Zara and H&M and Sanchos in, alongside one another. And also hope to sustain that system for however long we want to continue to the planet.
I would just say though, there is asset and value in the volume of clothing that already exists, and actually what we don't yet have is the ability to take that end-life garment and use that instead of raw materials, and that is possible. There are technologies in their nascent stages that would make that possible. And it's about getting there. I don't think buying and selling clothing in itself needs to be environmentally unsustainable, but the changes that are needed are drastic. They're not doing sustainable cotton or whatever, or releasing a conscious collection or launching a brand. That's not what's needed, because of like you say, because of limited
and that's
planetary
exactly what I was going to
resources.
say. If we look at the supply chain of these sort of fast fashion models, if they sort of adjusted to a more regenerative model, in isolation of how much money they're earning from it, if we started to use the garments that had already been produced, and Primark said, well, everything we make is now going to be made out of material that already exists, that would have huge impact. So it's about shifting to those models that actually promote circularity rather than adding a new brand here, adding a new brand here. I'm sure you've all heard of Earth Overshoot Day. Every single year we reach a calendar date where we've basically used all of the resources that Earth can sustain for that year. And every single year that happens in May, June and July, right? So before we've even gotten to the end of the year, we've used that year's allowance of resources. So it's kind of about making it to a point where we're actually negative with those resources, where in an ideal world, in 6 months' time, we won't even be anywhere near to maxing out the world's resources, but actually every year we do. So how do we shift models to actually complement that rather than what's happening at the moment?
And just on that, I think what's interesting about Earth Reshoot Day is that not every country reaches it at the same time, right? So then you have Ethiopia, for example. I think the Earth Reshoot Day is October 24th or something, and so the answers are there, and that's where the mindset is needed to respect and honour the intelligence of Black and brown people and the global majority, because our lifestyles are more sustainable. So that's another way it could become more sustainable.
Sorry. Thank you. I think we're up on time, but it's been great to have you all here today. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to Sustainable Fashion Week and all of the team. Thank you.